Hello and welcome to the Bartholomew School GCSE English Literature revision video focusing on how to answer the modern novel question for English Literature Paper 2. This video is about Lord of the Flies. If you're studying Animal Farm, stop watching this and go and find the correct video by looking in your revision booklet or by searching through our YouTube channel. Before we start properly, you need to make sure that you've got in front of you your GCSE English Literature revision advice and practice booklet, a highlighter, a pen and some lined paper. Pause the video if you need to and go and get those things. Before we do anything else, let me draw your attention to this piece of information. Unlike many of the other literature questions, the question that you will be asked on Lord of the Flies will not come with an extract. You'll be given a question about the whole novel. The mark scheme still demands that you quote and analyse in the same level of detail as every other question on the literature papers, all of which points to one irrefutable fact: you are going to have to memorise a significant number of quotations from Lord of the Flies if you're going to succeed here. As a practice today, we're going to look at question 1 from the Lord of the Flies questions in your booklet. How does Golding present victims in Lord of the Flies? Write about how different characters are presented as victims and how Golding uses victims to present ideas about people and society. So let's unpack this question with a highlighter, dissecting exactly what we're being instructed to do. Firstly, we can identify the focus of the question. We're being asked to look at a theme here, but to do it we will have to look at characterisation. Our answer needs to focus on victims. The question uses the word how and the word present. This tells us that we need to focus our answer on the techniques and methods that Golding uses. Notice that the question uses Golding's name. We're going to need to refer to the idea that Golding has intentions and that the effect on the reader is deliberate, so we should make sure that we use Golding's name in our answer. Now let's look at the bullet points. The first one encourages us to look at different characters, so we shouldn't just write about Piggy, for instance. And we're also being asked to look at the bigger ideas that Golding is presented about people and society. So let's think about how we go about planning this. For this question you get marked for 4 things. Your ideas, and the more intelligent they are the better. Quotations and analysis, and again the more detailed, technical and insightful the better. You need to write about context, and the more related it is to the task the better. And finally you are also marked for accuracy. There are 4 marks here for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Bearing all of that in mind, I'd suggest that you set out your planning a bit like this. For this video we're going to plan in a much more detailed way than you would actually have time to do in an exam, but it's good practice to see how to put ideas together. So the first thing I need to do is to come up with my ideas that answer the question, and they'll go as follows. So initially it seems that Golding uses juxtaposition of characters to distinguish victims from evil characters. So for that question we could look, for instance, at the difference between Piggy and Roger. However, I'll go on to say that Golding uses the victimisation of Piggy to suggest that the impulse to bully and belittle is innate. It's not reserved for just Roger and Jack. I'll go on to say that Golding uses the death of his victim Simon to represent innocence and the powerlessness of innocence in the face of corruption. So his victims in the novel fail. And then I'll go on to make my more philosophical point, which is that eventually society and civilization themselves become victims of savagery and instinct. So it isn't just characters who are victimised, but actually society itself becomes a victim. So how can I go about proving this? Well, my evidence for the juxtaposition of characters will be quite straightforward. I'm going to look towards the beginning of the novel and I'll look at the difference between Piggy and Roger. So Piggy takes the names of the little uns in the beginning and he really believes in the power of the conch. And when the fire starts to go out, Piggy is the one who is responsible and he asks repeatedly, is there a signal? He's desperate to be rescued. Roger, by contrast, enjoys throwing rocks at Henry, the little un, so where Piggy looks after them, Roger victimises them. And this develops, so I might make a reference to the unspeakable horror of Roger in that final chapter. So he goes from being evil in a sort of contained sense to unspeakably evil in the final chapter. So I'll analyse that by saying that Piggy represents responsibility and care. His insistence on rule following is interpreted as annoying, so like his repeated questioning when the fire goes out, there's a sense of irritation as he repeats himself, and yet the reader knows that he is right. Roger, by contrast, is inherently cruel, which is heightened by Henry playing innocently and Roger torturing him, and this culminates in ultimate savagery, having sharpened a stick at both ends in that final chapter. I need to link to context, so what can I say here? Well, I'd like to think about the British belief in being in the right in World War II, which Golding took issue with. There's a sense of right and wrong being very clear cut here, which we know from the rest of the novel isn't quite as straightforward as we might like to believe. So that will lead me to talk about my second point, the victimisation of Piggy. So here I'm going to look at the moment when Piggy gets his name. So he confides in Ralph. The fat boy glanced over his shoulder, then leaned towards Ralph to tell him that his nickname in school was Piggy. And Ralph, rather than responding in a kind way, shrieked with laughter. So how can I analyse this? Well, Piggy has obviously confided in Ralph. He's clearly anxious, and this contrasts with Ralph's delight in his torture. Ralph, with whom we sympathise, is cruel. The verb shrieked is extreme and animalistic. We're not allowed to like him straightforwardly. He isn't a straightforwardly good character. And in fact, even the narrative voice immediately takes up the name Piggy, so the reader is implicated in that cruelty as well. We are not allowed to be innocent. And let's take this to context. Golding is showing us that human nature is cruel. The novel doesn't allow us to believe that children are innocent, nor does it allow us to believe that we are innocent. For my third point, I'm going to look at that moment of the death of Simon. So I'll look at that shocking description of the crowd. At once the crowd surged after it, poured down the rock, leapt onto the beast, screamed, struck, bit, tore. And then we're told in the aftermath how small a beast it was. To analyse this, I must look at the verbs. I'm going to look at those verbs suggesting an unstoppable behaviour like water, and then the animalistic behaviour and horror of screamed, struck, bit and tore. Look at the noun, the crowd, which somehow excuses individuals. There is no one person who's guilty of this murder, but at the same time it makes all the other boys guilty of the murder. And then in that second quotation, I'd look at the contrast between the adjective small and the noun beast, which highlights Simon's vulnerability, his victimisation. And contextually, we're being shown something here about the power of primitive instinct. Even Piggy and Ralph are swept up in this dance that leads to the death of Simon. There's a shared guilt, nobody is innocent. And this again will take us back to the contextual idea of World War II, where Golding believed that all the nations were culpable, guilty of the horrors that were allowed to take place. And then my more abstract point about society and civilization becoming the victims of savagery and instinct, I'm going to back up by looking towards the end of the text. So Ralph comes close to forgetting about the purpose of the fire. He has to be reminded by Piggy about why the fire can't be allowed to go out. He starts to lose his grip on civilization. There are questions just before the death of Piggy. Which is better, law and rescue or hunting and breaking things up? And then after the death of Piggy, the boys hunting Ralph lose their human descriptions and become the savage. And then at the very end, after the rescue, Ralph wept for the end of innocence. So what can I say about these? Well, as I've mentioned, Ralph loses his sense of individuality and civilization, and he's in danger of becoming a savage himself. That question is really helpful for looking at the dichotomy between order and savagery, and what's interesting is that hunting and destruction win in the novel. I look at the dehumanisation of the boys, they're no longer given names, and then the end of the novel represents the end of innocence. But this is more than just a coming-of-age story. This is about society, not just about one boy growing up. This is about the death of society. Contextually, I can link this to the threat of nuclear war at the time that Golding is writing. There's a fear of the power of society to destroy itself. You'll want to have an introduction and a conclusion where you set out an argument, exploring a big idea, perhaps about guilt and innocence, or perhaps about the power of the dark side of human nature. This might cause you to reorder some of these points, but let's have a look at what a paragraph will look like when it's put together in an essay form. Golding uses the death of his victim character Simon to represent innocence and the powerlessness of innocence in the face of corruption. The description of Simon's death is shocking. At once the crowd surged after it, poured down the rock, leapt onto the beast, screamed, struck, bit, tore. Golding uses a syndeton, which means he doesn't use a connective, he doesn't use the word and. Here to present the overwhelming power of the crowd and to imply that the action of the crowd is uncontrolled and instinctive. Not only is Simon dehumanised here, referred to as it and the beast, but the crowd itself is described using verbs that remind us of the unstoppable nature of water. They surged and poured. Furthermore, the sentence ends with the violent and animalistic list of verbs screamed, struck, bit, tore, to emphasise the horror of the boy's actions. The collective noun the crowd on the surface excuses individuals of the crime of murder, but at a deeper level it shares the guilt. All of the boys are culpable for the murder of Simon. When Golding's narrator describes how small a beast it was, the adjective small contrasts the noun beast to highlight Simon's vulnerability. The death of this victim is presented as horrifying, and all of Golding's other characters are responsible for it, just as Golding felt the responsibility for the horrors witnessed in World War II were a shared responsibility for the nations. He does not allow any of his characters to be innocent of the primitive, destructive instinct he presents, suggesting that, contextually, Golding felt the horrors of the 20th century were a symptom of the darkness of human nature. So you should be able to see in my paragraph that I stick closely to the question. I answer it in my topic sentence, but I also refer to victims all the way through. I offer quotations as evidence. I analyse in lots of detail and I use technical terms. I finish off my paragraph by developing my idea in relation to context and in relation to what I think Golding might be trying to say about victims and society. So this answer should take you about 45 minutes to write, and you can look back at any part of this video to help you with the planning, and you can use your revision booklet to remind you what you're being marked on. Have a go at writing your response and hand it to your teacher for some feedback. Then you can try any of the other questions in the booklet using exactly the same method. Thank you for watching and good luck with your response.